oftentimes I was afraid in meetings. And it seemed like almost every Sunday, because of the things that were being preached over the pulpit, I would go home afraid that, I don't know, the evil spirits were after me, or that if I wasn't perfect, that I would be damned to hell. And just the sermons that were taught did oftentimes make us feel afraid. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Sam.
And I'm Melissa.
I was raised in the FLDS community. It is a polygamous group run by Warren Jeffs, and I moved out when I was 18 years old.
I was raised LDS. Sam and I have been married for almost 10 years and have 2 awesome kiddos.
Yes, we do. We want to quickly thank our donors, YouTube members, and our patrons on Patreon. We really do appreciate your support.
Yes, we do. We also want to mention that now our 2025 birthday cruise for me is now open and available on our website at growingupinpolygamy.com. You can go check out all the info. It's going to be a super fun cruise. It's on the Harmony of the Seas, Royal Caribbean. It's the 4th largest ship in the world. We are really, really excited for this trip, and there's lots of great stuff included in our package that, if you want to read more about it, you can go to the website and check it out, but we're really excited.
Yeah, we're excited for lots of reasons. One, to be able to meet many of you that can make it. That would be really, really awesome. We also are excited about the idea of sponsoring someone from a polygamous community that has not ever been on a big, not only cruise, but big vacation like this, to be able to come and enjoy with us for the first time.
Yes, and that's all of that is possible by awesome people coming and joining us. So we're really excited. Again, we will leave that link below for all the information on that. So go check it out.
Today, we're excited to introduce a new series of reaction videos that we're going to be reacting to Polygamy USA. It is a series about, or a show done about the group there in Centennial Park, which is the community right next to where I grew up. So I'm super excited about this one for many reasons, but one of those being that they were always so just out of reach. I never could quite understand what was going on over the hill. So to be able to watch this and react to this show is something that I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, it's cool that this was done by National Geographic, so it was cool to get to see the insider action that they got, like the insider footage and the things that they were able to see. Because we've talked to a couple people that have left Centennial Park before. And I know we had done a video before about some of the knowledge that we've gained through people that weren't even able to come on our show, but just the insider information that they've given us. And so this is like a really more in-depth view of their everyday life, which I think was fun. There were definitely comparisons to not only the FLDS, but then there were certain things that I was like, this is way more LDS than even FLDS. So
yes,
this is a fun one.
Yeah, Centennial Park, they split off from the FLDS, actually. So the FLDS split off from the mainstream LDS church, and then later down the road, a lot of the men that were a part of the FLDS, it wasn't called FLDS at that point, but that were a part of the church in that time, did not agree with the changes being made, and so they left and went over the hill to Centennial Park to continue on what they believed to be the right way to live fundamentalist polygamy, or fundamentalist Mormonism.
Yeah, so really it's following a couple main families throughout this documentary, and they talk about and show Isaiah Thompson. He has 2 wives, 5 children. They talk about the Hammonds a lot. Arthur Hammond is in charge of the Missionary program, which we'll get into. He has 3 wives and 20 kids. They follow some of their children. So really it's following certain people throughout the community and kind of giving insight to the way of life and the way that like the Centennial Park group practices polygamy, which at this point now we've done quite a few videos on the AUB or watched shows of people in the AUB, and there's some fun comparisons there too. I think one of the main things that sets them apart is from the FLDS, because the FLDS has arranged marriages. But the way Centennial Park does it is they call it placement marriage, and the women get to pick. When I say get to pick, the women have revelation on who they're supposed to marry, and they go to the men and say, I felt inspired that I'm supposed to be in your family. And they believe that's called placement marriage.
And that's one of those things that is more similar to the AUB. But I will say, though, back in the day when the the group that became the Centennial Park group split off from the FLDS group, the way of marriage was different back in those days. So I think they just continued on with what they believed to be true, and that Leroy Johnson, the prophet back then, was kind of doing. And then it was with the Jeffs where the, I guess, forced marriages or things where people
Arranged marriage.
arrange, that's the word, where arranged marriages were really, really big, and that people would just get a phone call and say, you are supposed to marry so-and-so.
And then 2 days later it would happen.
Right. So that happened later. So I don't think the Centennial Park people changed the way of doing things. I think they just continued on with the way it was before they split off.
Yeah, it was really interesting. One of the main people that they follow is Arthur Hammond, and he said 4th generation polygamist, so long family history of polygamy and fundamental Mormonism. But he's in charge of the missionaries. And this term missionaries, we've talked about before, means some very different things within Mormonism. So mainstream LDS, we got to start with my group. So
Yes.
mainstream LDS is that missionaries go out to all over the world, very far from where they live typically. There are service missions that you can do locally, but that's not the common term when you're thinking of a missionary. They travel away from their home for 2 years for young men, 18 months for young women, and they're going and preaching the gospel according to the LDS Church, and they're basically trying to baptize and convert and get new members. So that's like the typical missionary within mainstream Mormonism. But then in the FLDS, Sam just barely did a video about the fact that missionaries within your church was more of young men going and preaching to families, kind of
Yeah,
more
it
like
was-
home teaching.
Yeah, it was
that I grew
more
up with.
going and bearing testimony, sharing messages, checking in on the family, that kind of thing. But it wasn't ever leaving the community.
And no proselyting, right?
And no proselyting. I mean, I guess if there was a family that they thought maybe they were doing something inappropriate or weren't following the rules perfectly, maybe there was some, not proselyting in the sense of bringing new members to the church, but possibly going in to check on those that were not doing things properly to try to get them doing the right thing, I guess.
Yes. And then for the Centennial Park group, this was a whole different thing. They did say going on a mission.
They call it going on a
They
mission.
called it
yeah.
going on a mission, but they stay within the community, and it's a labor service mission, basically. So Arthur Hammond's in charge of these young men. These are all unmarried young men, and they're all men who are waiting for women to pick them, basically, to be
They're
married.
all over 18, right?
It looked like
I think they were unmarried adult man.
Yes. And at this point, they said, they had 32 young men that he was in charge of, or adult men, but they were all still fairly young.
Considering the entire community, at least at this time of the show, which was in 2013, was 1,500 people, that's quite a large percentage.
Yeah. And they're waiting to get married, and then they are doing community service and labor around the community. And they were talking about some of the, they're just really trying to reinforce the rules, trying to make these young men into being good husbands. Some of the things they were talking about is like, one guy had his hair too long. He said, daughters of Zion deserve better than slobs. They talked about the fact that these men are not allowed to date. They are not allowed to have any alcohol. They have to have a curfew, and they have to be home by 10 p.m. every night. And they have to do 15 minutes of scripture study a day.
Which is not, super...
That's
crazy,
super strict.
considering what missionaries entail in other groups as well.
Yeah, compared to an LDS missionary, you served a mission in Chile.
I did.
What kind of rules did those missionaries have?
Oh my goodness. Well,
More than those four.
yes, there was a lot. It was an hour of study each day, at least. And then if you're learning a new language, then time on top of that. And then it was definitely a very strict curfew, being home at a certain time. Each mission depended. It varied. Each mission was a little bit different as far as which time you had to be back at your apartment. But yes, there was no drinking, no dating, no swimming, no
Watching TV,
no social media. Listening to, I guess you could say, Gentile music.
We wouldn't call it Gentile music.
That's
though.
what I get that term from the FLDS.
Yes, but we would just say not listening to anything other than spiritual music.
Okay, so non-spiritual music.
Or church-approved music, sometimes it was also called.
Yes, and then most of the day was spent proselyting or going and visiting members of the church. So we were either studying in our apartment, studying, praying, planning for the day, or we were out hitting the streets and visiting people in their homes and things like that. So it was a full-time, always, even on Saturday and Sunday. There was one day a week, which was typically Monday, that was called your personal day. And that was the day to do your laundry, to go shopping and do different things like that. But even then, part of that day was spent visiting people as well. So it was it was definitely a lot of rules. It seems like
you could never be alone, right?
Yeah,
that's another
yes,
huge
you always
one.
have to be with a companion. So
and a companion is only another priesthood holder.
Right. Yep. So for the man, the missionaries, men had to be paired up with another missionary man, and then same with the women, they had to be paired up together. And yeah, so you really, unless you're going to the restroom or taking a shower or things like that, you're always supposed to be within view of your companion.
Did that feel like suffocating? Like to feel like you never had any alone time? Or since you grew up with 34 siblings, were you like, no, this is fine?
It was fairly easy for me, I will say. In fact, when I got back from my mission 2 years later, I had gotten so used to it that when I got home and I was allowed to just go do what I wanted to do by myself and not have someone there with me, it felt strange. I felt like I need someone to be with me, right? I can't just go make decisions on my own like this. So I got used to it, and it wasn't that strange for me. I know that for some people it was hard, but for me, I feel like it was pretty easy to get used to. Yeah.
They talked about Ezra, Arthur's son. Arthur had shared many times, even though he's training all these missionaries, not all of his children chose to stay within the community. They didn't really go into how cut off people are if they leave the community, but they did mention a lot about the fact that people could leave of their own free will. Like, you don't have to stay here. Now, of course, they're going to say that to cameras.
I was going to say, I have something to say about this.
Okay.
Also, I want to point out that the Hammond name is a very, very big name within the Centennial Park group. Reason being is because Marion Hammond was one of the founders. They wouldn't say founder because they believe they just continued on with God's work, and the church has always been the same, right?
Yeah.
But just so that it's easier to understand, Marion Hammond was a very, very big name in getting the church started there, as well as Alma Timpson. So kind of the two of them were the main two people that started this, that broke off from the FLDS church. And so it sounds like that Arthur, right?
Yep.
Arthur Hammond is very, very closely related and was a part of the building up of the church in the very beginning as well.
Yeah, but he even said this, a lot of his children have chosen to leave, and everyone kind of mentioned that they all knew quite a few people who did not choose to continue the lifestyle. Again, I know we're going to have somebody on here in a couple weeks that lived in Centennial Park for a while and can maybe give some more insight on how much they shun, or if they're a little bit more open to the idea of people choosing what they want to choose.
And what I wanted to say about people being free to leave is that's what the FLDS would say too. So I just want to put that into perspective, that we were taught as well that if we choose to leave, you can leave.
But how you'll be treated after.
Now, we've all heard the stories on what that looks like, though, for your life and how that affects your life if you do choose to leave. And we're talking just about the temporal, physical stuff on this earth, let alone what we were taught our entire lives to believe that would happen to us spiritually and in the afterlife. So, sure, you're free to leave. Go to hell, right? So it's not as simple as they make it sound in this show.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that was really intriguing to me is I felt like the church, they had some footage of inside the church. The church looked way more like the LDS than the FLDS church.
Right, the inside of their building.
Yeah, the way the pews were set up, the way that they had the chairs at the front that had the leadership. They called it the Council of Priesthood, so I think it was set up a little bit differently.
So I will say that in the FLDS meeting house, my childhood meeting home, how to say it? It's not we didn't call it a church building. We always called it a meeting house, and people have asked me why, and I don't know. It's just In fact, when I left and I heard the name church being thrown around, it kind of sounded inappropriate. Like, no, it's a meeting house. And I don't know why church wasn't really allowed. But anyway, it was set up similar to the mainstream LDS, just in a much larger scale.
I was just thinking that. I'm like, it was probably just because your meeting house had to house so many more people.
In fact, I would say the way that the meeting house of the FLDS was set up was more similar to the general conference meeting house, because it had the choir behind them and the leaders sitting in their more comfortable style chairs and things like that. But of course, in a smaller scale than the general conference.
Yeah, for me, when I saw the Centennial Park chapel, I was like, that's very much what it looked like in an LDS church. And I feel like the speakers too, like they had a leader and then they had called on someone within the community to come in and speak. And that's how it is within the mainstream LDS as well, that the preacher, it's not one preacher that preaches every single week, and they actually call upon members of the community and they prepare talks or sermons for the group, which, go ahead.
So this was interesting to me, and I actually remember feeling that it was different in the mainstream LDS church after I had left the FLDS and got familiar with the mainstream LDS church, that it was so organized, that people had a week or so to prepare for a talk, and that they were assigned a certain topic and things like that. Because it seemed like that in the FLDS church, it was fairly common for someone to just be called upon in the audience, or one of the priesthood man to be called upon that was sitting on a stand to stand up and give a talk. And not always were they given any kind of warning, that they just kind of had to be prepared to give some kind of talk. And so, I mean, there were moments where they were told in advance, hey, you will be speaking, but not always. And I saw this little clip in this show that showed, and I don't know if he was told in advance or not, but the leader that was speaking in their meeting house called upon one of the men and just said, and I would like to call upon so-and-so to come and give a talk. And he stood up and gave a talk. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, seeing that, even though it was just through the show, it gave me a very weird feeling that I did not expect. I did not expect it. Just the way that it was handled, the way that it was done, and then the things that the preacher was saying, I felt this uncontrollable fear that it came out of nowhere. And I can't attach it to any specific memory that I have, but it just brought fear into my stomach felt weird, like something was just tense, and I felt afraid for no reason that I can remember. But just wanted to point that out, that the way that it was done in this show brought back something to me, and I'm not sure what it was.
Yeah, it was crazy because you just paused and you were like, this makes me feel like fearful.
The best I can describe is fearful. And the only thing I can think of that might have caused that is that oftentimes I was afraid in meetings. And it seemed like almost every Sunday, because of the things that were being preached over the pulpit, I would go home afraid that, I don't know, the evil spirits were after me, or that if I wasn't perfect, that I would be damned to hell. And just the sermons that were taught did oftentimes make us feel afraid. So maybe that's what it came from.
Another thing I thought was really interesting about the meetings, one family in particular, I don't know if this is just for their family or if it's a church rule. They said that they had decided that no one in their family under the age of 8 or anyone that had not been baptized into the church went to church. And when they were showing everybody in the church building, I noticed that there weren't any young children. So I'm guessing it's not just their family that does that. But that was really interesting because in the mainstream LDS, people are wrestling their infants and children and toddlers and trying to get them to hold still like the whole time. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely distracting, but it's part of like, I think I was raised to be taught that if you want your children to be able to behave in church, the only way is for them to practice. Mm-hmm. So you take them from a young age, and when they start crying and whining, you take them out, and then you're kind of wrestling with them in the foyer where they have speakers so you can still hear, or in the mother's room they have speakers so you can hear if you're nursing a young child. And I don't know. So the idea that just, nope, church isn't for you till you're baptized, till you're a member of the church. You don't go to church. I thought that was really interesting.
It is interesting. I think, as far as the FLDS goes, I think that some children did attend, but I do remember when I first attended the mainstream LDS church meetings, I remember seeing and feeling like there were a lot of children. So,
and that's saying something coming from the FLDS, and you're like, there's a lot of kids in here.
Yes. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, looking back on my childhood, there were definitely kids in the meetings. Maybe it was more infants. The mother needed to be nursing the baby at certain times, and so that's why they brought the children, and then the other toddlers and slightly older children stayed home with someone to watch. My memory is a little fuzzy there, but all I can say is that I do remember seeing and feeling that there were a lot of children in the mainstream. So that leads me to believe that maybe quite a few of the children did stay home in the FLDS church as well until they were at the age 8.
Yeah, it was interesting. Another thing, along with like the council, they called it the Council of Priesthood instead of like a bishopric or anything. So they still obviously believe in the priesthood. They talked about the Council of Priesthood, where the men were the ones who did the ordinances, which is really typical within Mormonism. But one thing they did that was different than the LDS and much more like the FLDS is they called, like Arthur was called Uncle Arthur. Within the mainstream LDS church, you call each other brother and sister and then their last name. And that's typical unless they've been a bishop. And then they get that title of bishop forever from then on. But as far as calling uncle,
so uncle,
that's all you.
Yeah, uncle in the FLDS church was for some reason, what we would call all of those within high leadership positions within the church. Like you will hear FLDS people call Warren Jeffs Uncle Warren. Mm-hmm. Uncle Rulin, Uncle Fred. Fred Jessup was the bishop. He was called Uncle Fred. So they would put uncle in front of the name. And in fact, my own father was called uncle by many people throughout the community because he had a high calling in the church. So for some reason, and I don't know where that came from or why, but it was just a way of respecting this person by calling them uncle, even though the people calling them uncle had in most cases anyway, had no biological ties, or they weren't blood related in any way.
Maybe they just took the whole brother and sister thing and they were just like, what gives them that status just a little bit more than a brother or a sister as an uncle?
Yeah, I don't know.
We'll have to look up and see if we can find the history on that. Or someone knows, leave it in the comments section.
If there even is a reason, or if people just started doing it and it became a thing.
Or maybe because almost everyone is an uncle of somebody else somehow.
Maybe it did start with relatives and then someone else heard them and said, oh, that's a good idea. I'll call them uncle too.
Yeah, maybe. One of the things that I thought was funny, I don't know, I thought it was funny, was that the men were playing the turkey bowl, and it was the married men versus the unmarried men, and all of the unmarried girls would go and watch, and they were like, okay, sorry. I have to just say, Sam and I were laughing because this is National Geographic that's doing this video, and the narrator is like the same guy that you hear do the cheetah videos, do his voice.
Or any
wildlife documentary
videos. And so it was just so funny because you hear him talking and narrating this show, and it sounds like these people are out in the jungles or something, and they're so I'm trying to remember the words he said. Yes. So he's like, on events like these, the young girls will come to find their mate. Basically,
these women can receive revelation.
To receive revelation on which man they should marry. And they would talk just like that, and it sounds just like it was like this wild, I don't know.
Like
the female comes to see which male is stronger, and then we'll choose the male that dominates the game. I don't know. It was just so much fun to listen to them while watching these neighbors that were my neighbors growing up, basically just over the hill. It just was a funny thing to see for me.
Yeah, it was pretty comical, and they need to have a different narrator for like the animal kingdom versus humans, because it was seeming all too animalistic, and it was hard to take what he was saying seriously in that moment.
Yeah, but I mean, he's got a great voice, so I mean, I'll give it. I mean, it sounded great, but it's just we've seen too many animal kingdom videos now to see the animals being talked about. And the funny thing is, because they live so traditional, some of the same words that he would use in someone finding their mate in the wild was similar to what he was using here. And maybe they did that for a reason.
They did it on purpose.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't
man.
know. It was fun.
The last event after the football game, where the girls got to watch men play football, was talking about one of the ladies in the community that was a really big part of the community and big part of trying to make law changes in Utah. She passed away from cancer, and they had a couple unique things about the burial and the traditions when it comes to burying somebody within the religion. One was that they mentioned that the first death was leaving the Father's presence and coming to the earth, and that the mortal death was the second death. Now, Sam and I looked at each other because talking about a first death and a second death is pretty common within Mormonism. It might even be within Christianity. I'm not sure. Somebody let me know.
Help us out.
If you hear that as well, because it's definitely a common saying. But as we were discussing more, we kind of had been taught that the first death was your mortal death, and the second death was whether or not you were going to have a spiritual death, depending on your judgment.
Which means, yes, spiritual death would mean that you are thrust into everlasting hell and torment, and your spirit. Actually, hold on. The spiritual death was that your spirit would die, so that you would go into nothingness, basically.
Yes. Which would only be outer darkness.
Which would be that's the word, outer darkness. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I always had heard as well. So it's interesting to me that they believe that the second death is just your physical mortal death.
Yeah.
So now I'm curious. Hopefully they'll get into this in future episodes. This is all just in episode 1. So hopefully they'll get into maybe what the afterlife would look like for them.
Yeah. The second thing was they did take a lot of pride in the way that they buried her. And they talked about preserving the burial for the resurrection and how important it was that she would be able to find her body when it was time for the resurrection. She would be able to return to it in its purified state. So, I mean, I know all of Christianity believes in a resurrection, but the amount of care and effort they were putting into making sure that her body could be as preserved as possible for her resurrection.
Mm-hmm. And they also all wore white instead of black because they looked at it as a universal symbol of purity, and that this person
was to honor her purity.
And that she would be moving on to live with in the celestial kingdom, basically. And a lot of them even wore white shoes, or the man would wear white ties. The man did wear black suits, but white ties and white shirts and things.
Because they needed to dress their best, but make sure they wore a white tie to symbolize the purity. So.
Yeah, and I definitely know that in the FLDS church, and I think also in the mainstream, people didn't dress in all black because, especially in the FLDS church, I'll speak for myself here, that they never looked at it as this. It was, yes, people would mourn the loss of loved ones, for sure. But in the meetings, it was very much talked about how it is a joyous occasion that now they can be reunited with their loved ones on the other side and God, and that, we will one day, especially for the older ones that had lived a long, good life. Of course, it was sad for people that passed away at a young age. But anyway, it was never everyone dressed in black and covered their face, anything like that.
Yeah, I think Arthur even said, today we will weep for those that are left behind, but not for the person that had passed because they are, with the Father again. So, and with their loved ones on the other side. So that was a little bit different. The white, I definitely know within the mainstream LDS, it isn't as traditional in the all black. People would still wear black, but you could pretty much wear any church dress. The only reason I know that it's definitely not as traditional is because my mom grew up on the East Coast, and she grew up Lutheran and very traditional, you would always wear black. So my family to funerals would always wear black, and that was kind of emphasized in my family. And I remember it always it never ceased to shock my mom when people would show up, and she was a convert to the LDS church, when she'd show up to an LDS funeral and people weren't in black, or especially if people wore lighter colors like pastels or whites or something like that. And she would just be like, why are they doing that? It didn't make sense to her culturally because she hadn't been raised in the LDS church. But I would say people just wore Sunday dresses. And if that was flowery, or if it was, it wasn't as much of a traditional all black type of affair.
Yeah. I would say in all Mormonism is not looked at as like a good thing when someone dies, but when someone does pass away, it's looked at as this opportunity for them to be reunited in the heavens.
Yeah.
And
everyone will see each other again and be together for eternity. So you only have to survive the rest of your life, the rest of this earthly life without that person.
And based on all of the experiences that I have seen and experienced in every funeral that I've been to, at least within Mormonism type funerals, only the positives of the person is what is rejoiced and talked about in their funeral.
I think that's every funeral.
Is that every funeral?
That's every funeral,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, good.
You don't
Because, I mean, even in the FLDS, where
about the dead.
Right. Well, even in the FLDS, where things are a little bit more strict and intense, right? It seemed like even then, if someone had been rebellious or something and passed away, maybe doing something they weren't supposed to do, of course, throughout the community, you might hear whispers of people saying, well, if they weren't doing such and such on such and such day or whatever, like they were, maybe if they were more obedient, this wouldn't have happened to them. But in the actual setting of the funeral, I'm happy to say that based on my experience, it was all positive.
Yeah. The last thing that I want to point out is something that Arthur said multiple times throughout the show, and they clip to it a lot. And I'd say that almost every person within Mormonism is going to feel the same way. And he said, religion is not part of our life. It is our life.
That's got to be a quote from that my mother uses all the time as well, because it sure seems that way for her.
Yep. And I think anybody within any different sect of Mormonism is going to feel the same. Mormonism was founded on principles that are meant to be your whole life and to consume it, and that your life is dedicated to the church and to the gospel of Jesus Christ as they see it. And so that is, like, when I saw that quote, I was like, that is definitely something I think any faithful Latter-day Saint would say in any sect.
I mean, and there's no wonder why, right? Yeah. There's no wonder. It's not about, at least the way I was taught in every different circumstance, that it's not about coming to this life and just finding a way to enjoy this life, to, focus on this life. It's always been, this is a moment to prove yourself. What you can rejoice and look forward to is the life to come. I mean, and maybe that sounds kind of scary, but when you're raised to believe that God sent us here so that we could prove ourselves, to accept him and become as he is, that's the way that it was put, then it's all about proving yourself on this earth and then returning to live in paradise forever if you pass the test.
I think that's definitely a more FLDS focus than LDS. At least I feel like the way.
And it's very likely that it was, but that's just what I remember being told growing up.
Yeah, within the LDS, we were taught that not only is this a trial and test, like there's definitely specific things you have to do to return back to God again, very specific. But we were also taught that the experiences that you could have on earth were only possible here. And so the knowledge that you gained here was invaluable. And you needed that knowledge in the next life to be the best God that you could be in the eternities. Mm-hmm. So it was very much like, I feel like the emphasis for me was that this life was to gain as much knowledge and to have as many good experiences as possible so that you could be more knowledgeable and more ready for your life to come. Does that make sense? It's more like preparedness and a trial at the same time.
But still to prove yourself.
Oh yeah, you still have to.
That's my point. That's my point. I wasn't saying that it's all that your life has to be miserable. I'm just saying that ultimately the most important thing
is to pass the test. Yeah. If you want to hear more of what it was like for Sam to grow up in polygamy, or more content like this, where we're going to be in this series, basically for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be going over every episode of Polygamy USA, learning more about the Centennial Park group, comparing it to the FLDS, LDS, Mormonism in general, then please like and subscribe.
Yes, thank you all so much. We look forward to talking with you soon.
Talk to y'all soon.